Okay. Alright, I still have a little bit of time. Manipulated mind. I'm reading a real academic book, yes, that quotes peer-reviewed real academic papers. I might be crazy, but I'm not giving you bullshit. Alright. So, what were their names? Hinkle Jr. and Harold Wolff have asserted, however, that the bad guys made a concerted effort to produce particular emotions in a particular order, which then led to capitulation and collapse. They listed them in the article in the Bulletin of the New York Academy of Medicine in September 1957. The emotions to be aroused were anxiety, suspense, awareness of being avoided, feelings of unfocused guilt, fear and uncertainty, bewilderment, increasing depression, fatigue, despair, great need to talk, utter dependence on anyone who befriends, a great need of approval of the interrogator, and increased suggestibility. This all culminated in confession, rationalization of the confession, and final profound relief. As the U.S. Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry in 1956 held 2 symposia on forced indoctrination, to which Dr. Wolff presented research. He outlined 8 of the communist method for achieving the above ends. The description here is based on that in Peter Watson's excellent book, War on the Mind. 1. The bad guys enforced trivial demands, such as the keeping of insignificant rules or forced writing to accustom the prisoners to being compliant. They took pains to show the prisoners that they were in total control of the latter's fate, pretended to take cooperation for granted, and tantalized them with possible favors. From this, the prisoners learned the uselessness of trying to maintain any semblance of control themselves. They learned helplessness. 3. Occasionally, the bad guys would offer favors when they could least be predicted, rewarded any show of cooperation, promised better conditions, or demonstrated unexpected kindness, all of which served to give the men motivation to comply and to prevent them from adjusting to deprivation. 4. Threats of torture, death, no return home, isolation, interminable interrogation, or threats against family and friends served to deepen the men's fears, anxiety, and despair. 5. Degradation, such as the prevention of personal hygiene, humiliations, punishments, insults, foul living conditions, and no privacy, had the effects of making continued existence seem pointless and counterproductive. Forced to be concerned only with the most basic of values, it seemed that compliance could not but help raise self-esteem. 6. By forcing the men to be in darkness or in bright light, in an unstimulating environment, without the derision of various food or books or freedom of movement. The bad guys could force the men to dwell on their captivity, with the resultant confusion arising from excessive introspection. 7. Complete or semi-physical isolation served the same ends, as well as depriving the victim of any social support other than that of his jailer, on whom he became increasingly dependent. 8. Physical pressures, such as semi-starvation, induced illness, sleep deprivation, prolonged periods of standing or interrogation, and constant tension, all worked on the men until they were mentally too weakened to resist. In an article published in the Manipulation of Human Behavior, edited by Bilderman and Zimmer, Hengel explained why and how the physical stresses took their particular mental toll. The brain's internal milieu, he wrote,
contains a number of organic and inorganic substances in solution. Disturbances in the levels of these can adversely affect the way the brain functions. Not only may the brain itself be directly affected by these fluctuations, but it may also be indirectly affected when fluctuations impair other vital organs. The kinds of common conditions which may cause disturbances include sweating, water deprivation, salt deficiency, excessive water or salt, vomiting, diarrhea, and burns. Some people, when extremely anxious, start breathing too rapidly, and this can cause chemical changes in the blood, which in turn can affect the brain. Because the brain can only use carbohydrates for energy, not fats and proteins as other organs can, it is very quickly affected by any drop in sugar levels in the blood, sometimes caused by overanxiety. A deficiency of B vitamins in the diet can directly affect the brain. Indirectly, the brain may be harmed by any malfunction of the lungs, liver, or heart, as the efficient working of the brain is dependent on the swift removal of all metabolic end products present in the fluid surrounding it. Brain syndrome, as it's termed, describes the progressive mental deterioration that occurs when the brain is seriously impaired. Initially, a patient is restless and overtalkative, then generally he becomes delirious, confused, and finally loses consciousness. In the early stages, however, there is no obvious sign of brain damage. The patient manifests mainly emotionality, depression, irritability, jumpiness, or tension, all of which could be attributed to particular life circumstances. Speech deteriorates slightly as he gets a little vague and forgetful, but the patient can still perform intellectually, if a little less efficiently than usual. Hinkle says, in this state, the subject may have no frank hallucinations or delusions, but he overvalues small events, misinterprets, blames others, and accepts explanations and formulations which he might regret as patently absurd under different circumstances. He does not confabulate, but he may be willing to state that a report is clearly true or that an event actually occurred, when in fact the report merely could be true, or the event might have occurred. His intellectual functions, his judgment, and his insight decline to a similar degree. Hinkle suggests, as the prisoners in Korea were all kept in bad conditions, they might have suffered these initial stages of the brain syndrome. Also, as the brain needs information of various kinds to process and keep it alive, periods of isolation or repetitive carrying out of only one mental activity as a work duty were likely to tire the brain and cause it to deteriorate, though, again, the effects would not immediately be obvious. Despite the fact that the physical tolls on the brain must affect its functioning, Hinkle points out that the deterioration does not occur at the same rate in all people. He believes the personality of the individual plays a strong part in determining who holds out the longest. In short, the brain, the organ that deals with information, also organizes its response on the basis of information previously fed into it. This information, in the form of a personality developed through the experience of a lifetime, as well as immediate attitudes and the awareness of the immediate situation, conditions the way the brain will react to a given situation. There can be no doubt that personality, attitude, and the perceptions of the immediate situation seriously influence the ability of a brain to endure the effects of isolation, fatiguing tasks, and loss of sleep. Not only does personality affect when the brain syndrome starts, but it also affects the form that syndrome will take, determining whether a particular man will become talkative, withdrawn, anxious or angry, paranoid or trusting. He ends by saying, disordered brain function is indeed easily produced in any man. No amount of willpower can prevent its occurrence. Psychologist Joost Merleau draws on psychoanalytic and conditioning theory to explain the brainwashing of the American soldiers. He coined the term menticide to describe it. Merleau was a one-time chief on the Netherlands Forces Psychology Department who became an American citizen in 1950. He was called as an expert to give evidence to the military inquiry on the Colonel Schwabel case. Colonel Schwabel, an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps, confessed in Korea that America had been carrying on bacteriological warfare against the enemy, citing supposed missions, meetings, and strategy conferences, as well as naming names. Merleau's position is that successful menticide techniques make full use of people's deep and underlying guilt feelings and their unconscious need to be conditioned by and conform to traditional patterns. He believes people fear the freedom and the conflicts that complete autonomy brings. Autonomy. That people fear the freedom and conflicts that complete autonomy brings. He actually claimed that the bad guys capitalized on the findings of Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov, in regard to conditioned behavior. What time is it? Good. Pavlov discovered that he could make dogs salivate when they heard a bell. By ringing a bell whenever he gave them food, he led them to associate the two events. He had conditioned an unnatural response. He went on from this discovery to find out much about conditioned behavior, see Chapter 4, and the circumstances that could facilitate or impede it. One such finding that Merleau believes the communists picked up was the fact that conditioning could most easily be affected if the process was carried out in a quiet environment with few distracting stimuli. Political victims, therefore, were more easily conditioned if kept in isolation from each other. It was Pavlov who first found that some animals learn more quickly if they are rewarded for doing so, by affection or the giving of food, whereas others responded more effectively if they suffered painful penalty for mistakes. The differences, Merleau suggests, are likely to be related to the nature of earlier conditioning by parents. As, in people, the effect might be that one person could resist indefinitely in the face of punishment, whereas he could be easily won over by rewards. Interrogators could not use reward and punishments indiscriminately if they wanted results. They knew that they had to find out first which category their prisoner belonged to. The use, by the bad guys, of boring, repetitive routines was based, says Merleau, on the Pavlovian finding that any kind of previous conditioning, no matter how strong, could be rendered ineffective, inhibited by boredom. Finally, he suggests that the bad guys developed a suggestion made by Pavlov that weak secondary stimuli could also have conditioning qualities, the tone in which the words are spoken being as effective as the actual words for shaping behavior. Pavlov didn't pursue this area of thought far, but in the 1950s, the role of linguistics in mass indoctrination was studied by other Russian psychologists. Merleau is careful to state, however, that it is too simplistic to believe that permanent changes can be made to a person's thoughts and behavior just by straightforward application of Pavlovian theories of conditioning. He does believe that it can be a powerful means for capitalizing on the deeper emotional insecurities of man once aroused. For instance, in isolation, when a prisoner is closed off from the world and deprived of the usual range of stimuli from the senses, his mental activity changes. He starts to dwell on long-forgotten anxieties that arise to the surface of his and his fantasy life grows more real than his real life. In that state, he is vulnerable, as he cannot check the validity of his feelings and fantasies against ordinary reality. In fact, far from saying that conditioning of behavior is the main thrust of brainwashing techniques, Merleau emphasizes that a human being's own basic drives and needs can lead him unwittingly to take part in the brainwashing process. Need for companionship doesn't disappear when a guard or an interrogator is the only person available that can possibly offer it. Few personalities, he says, can resist the need to yield if they are suffering overwhelming loneliness. The first step toward yielding may well be that the prisoner, when in isolation and convinced by the enemy that everyone has deserted him, accepts and even welcomes the jailer as a substitute friend. Similarly, the victim may also pay for his capitulation, his to himself unforgivable need to draw comfort and friendship from wherever source he can, by becoming even more cruel to himself than the inquisitor could be. This passive attempt at annihilating the enemy adds even more stress to an already intolerable load. The prisoner is fighting himself as well as his captors, leaving himself doubly weakened. Just as successful brainwashing cannot be achieved by the cold application of techniques that take no account of the prisoner's personality, his fear, insecurities, and basic needs, so, says Merleau, training soldiers to withstand physical tortures is for similar reasons ineffective as a method to help them resist being brainwashed by captors. It is not physical torture that is the most effective weapon of brainwashing. The very teaching of evasive techniques to withstand torture itself induce psychological reactions in the soldiers so trained that can work against their resistance, not for it. The aroused anxiety and the dread anticipation, knowing what may happen, can lead a prisoner to capitulate all the sooner. It is only by applying effective mental strategies that anyone can resist, and those mental strategies have to be drawn from a balanced perspective on life. Without that perspective, operating in an ordinary daily life, they cannot be pulled out of the hat, ready to apply when or if one suddenly finds himself in a powerful, coercive, and unnatural milieu. See Merleau's Mental Seduction and Menticide. Robert Lufton's study of brainwashing techniques, which he termed thought reform, also relies for its conclusions on psychoanalytic theory. Lifton took part in the examination of the American POWs on the troop ship back to the United States, but his real work began when he went to Hong Kong and interviewed in depth a number of Western and Chinese civilians who had been living in China during the time of the communist takeover in 1948. Subsequently, they had escaped to Hong Kong. In his book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, he described and assessed the experience of 15 intellectuals who had undergone reform in universities and revolutionary colleges, and 25 Westerners who were believed by the bad guys to be antagonistic to the communist regime and underwent reform in prisons. One of the Westerners was a Frenchman, Dr. Charles Vincent, who had lived and worked at the bad place for 20 years before his arrest. Accused of being a spy, he was in prison for 3.5 years. Of him and another prisoner, Father Luca, both of whom were trapped into making extensive confessions of acts never carried out, as well as unfounded denunciations of friends. Lufton said, their environment did not permit any sidestepping. They were forced to participate, drawn into the forces around them until they themselves began to feel the need to confess and reform. His penetration by the psychological forces of the environment into the inner emotions of the individual person is perhaps the outstanding psychological fact of thought reform. Lipton identified the process at work as follows. 1. Assault on identity. Dr. Vincent was told that he was not a real doctor. Father Luca that he was not a genuine father. Both, as they began to lose their bearings, started to question who and what they were. 2. Guilt. Both men found themselves condemned by an infallible environment. They became so permeated by an atmosphere of guilt that the accusations being leveled at them merged with subjective feelings of sinfulness and having done wrong. They knew they were guilty of something. Well, they felt very guilty, and gradually grew to believe that punishment must be deserved. 3. Self-betrayal. The denunciation they were forced to make of friends and colleagues had a dual effect. It increased their feelings of guilt and shame, but, equally fundamental, by denouncing all those with whom they had associated in their lives, they were effectively denouncing that what their lives had been up until that point. They were not so much betraying friends as being forced to betray the vital core of themselves. 4. Breaking point. The combined effects of severe guilt, shame, self-betrayal led them to feel alienated from themselves. They began to fear total annihilation, and as everything that happened fanned rather than dispelled that fear, they moved inexorably toward breakdown. 3. Leniency. The inevitability of total annihilation would suddenly be overturned by a showing of unexpected leniency on part of their captors. A brief rest from interrogation, a brief encounter in which they were treated momentarily as individuals, summoned for the men a spark of renewed identity. Suddenly, annihilation was not the only outcome they could envision. Annihilation could, and now must, be avoided, and there was only one immediate way to achieve that. For a man in such a position, said Lufton, the psychological decompression of his environment serves to win him over to the reform camp. The men virtually became grateful participants in their own reform. 6. Compulsion to confess. Confession, in that it offered a way to resolve the overwhelming guilt engendered, gradually became more and more attractive. The compulsion to end the horrors of confusion and identity loss by owning up to that guilt was finally irresistible. 7. Channeling of guilt. The amorphous, formless guilt that had been drawn from them could be given an understandable form, if they adopted the people's standpoint. Their guilt could be attributed to a life of wrong action created by a wrong ideology. 8. Re-education. Logical dishonoring. To achieve true re-education, the prisoners had to extend their self-condemnation to every aspect of their former lives, to see their lives as a long series of utterly shameful acts. 9. Progress and harmony. The rightness of their new reformed position was reinforced by the many emotional needs that were met as well as a result of their holding it. They could feel the group intimacy in their living and working. They could participate in pursuing a common goal. They could experience the relief of solving all problems, refusing all confusion. Instead of alienation, they could experience themselves as in harmony with their surroundings. 10. Final confession and rebirth. In this new spirit of harmony, the men were fully ready to supply with conviction statements about what they now were, and what they had rejected. They experienced a virtual rebirth. Lipton later claimed, in all the cases of apparent conversion, similar emotional factors seemed to be played on, particularly a strong and readily accessible negative identity. an unusually strong susceptibility to guilt, a tendency toward identity confusion, particularly if a cultural outsider, and an all-for-nothing type of emotional set. Particularly interesting, however, was Lufton's findings that will have to wait until tomorrow. Oh yeah. Woo-hoo. So we'll find out what's particularly interesting tomorrow. I guess I'm not going to be able to get this book in the next 5 days. We'll find out. Toodaloo.